three age groups: adults, teens, and children. And the categories include those in the household or those designated by an admin as a household member, family external to the household, friends, and unknowns. Our first policy is object ordering. This is our safety policy and uses negative semantic markers, or objects we've learned negative associations with, to determine branching in our tree. We designate dangerous objects as those logically known to cause harm with intended or misuse, and mind-altering objects as subjects intended for ingestion, but with mind-altering or overdose properties. If a dangerous object has been delivered to the user, a history of this will be maintained for 30 minutes, and for mind-altering objects, this will be for 4 hours. This history will affect the branches in the tree and limit the user groups and objects that can be delivered.
Mentioned, we incorporated emotions into our design decisions. We call this our emotional policy, which borrows from the idea of emotional valence and arousal. Valence indicates the level of positive or negative emotions, while arousal indicates the level of physical reaction to a given emotional state. Using a grid, we place a user's affect on an X and Y axis to map out their current state. And certain areas on this grid are considered dangerous, concerning, cautious, or safe. In the red zone of the graph, we indicate highly fragile states of well-being, mostly associated with extreme anger. If in the red zone, requesting a dangerous or mind-altering substance is denied at all levels or for all groups, as this could lead to physical or emotional damages. In the orange zone, we have our category of concern and require more context policy checks, which will be discussed momentarily. It limits dangerous and mind-altering objects, especially when previously coupled with mind-altering objects. In this area, we have extreme sadness, such as depression, and as such, certain objects, like mind-altering objects, include additional barriers of access because we want to reduce the risk of harm, such as suicide. In the yellow zone, we have an area of caution and also requires additional context policy checks. However, this zone is more flexible and less severe than the orange and red zone, as this zone is more for situations where someone is not in a positive or neutral mood, but they're also not in an extreme negative state. The green zone is our safe zone, and restrictions do not occur at this emotional policy level, but instead occur at a different level given the policy.
Our object category policy then defines the category the object belongs to, and as such, it has its own contextual questions and considerations. We have attempted to make these categories broad so that any object can be assigned to one of the defined categories. Our context policy is branch specific, and it's enacted most often after a dangerous emotion or dangerous object, ensuring that the object is being used for the intended purpose. However, in some cases, it is object specific. For example, checking the age and asking for alcohol, or making sure a parent is present if a child's asking for toothpaste. As such, these branches are very specific and they take a lot of care to design. These are confirmed with verbal confirmations or sensor detection, such as detecting the presence of a parent or which room the robot's currently in. Lastly, we have our personal policy. This maintains the security of personal objects. This is a controlled hierarchy by an administrator. The administrator can designate personal objects from certain object categories and can also designate other users to select their own personal objects or assign the personal objects to those users. Users cannot select objects as their own if they've already been designated as personal by someone else. This helps to protect important personal documents, but also simple personal items such as clothing. So here you can see examples of our policy trees. This is the top level, beginning with the previous object check, then following down to an emotion check. And you can see the several branches end right here, such as 2 dangerous objects in a row, and then a red zone emotion, or a mind-altering then a dangerous, or 2 mind-altering objects. And here to the left, you can see a mind-altering object followed by a non-dangerous object with an orange emotional context. You can note that the next thing we check is the object category. It's asked because we had a previously mind-altering object, and certain groups, such as transport, are completely cut off. And at the leaves, you can see those that are in a green box are the list of allowed groups. And to the right here, you can see an example of a policy level where the previous branch was non-dangerous and a green zone. And then we reiterate that for these types of branches, there may need to be several different context checks, and you need to take care in order to construct them.
In this work, we adopt behavior traits as our overall implementation design. And so basically, the trait shows here will be repeated for each item. And for each item, the trait will basically execute the child node from left to right. So the first, it will be checking if there is any previous knowledge on the task or the environment. If it returns negative or false, it will just detect the current task and environment information that will be used for our 5 policies, and all this information will be write to the Blackboard, which is a storage place for the behavior trace. If it detects positive, or after it finished detecting all the information, so basically the behavior tree will go to the next child node, and which will read all the information that is useful for our 5 policies from the Blackboard. After we get enough information, all the sufficient information to check on if there's any violation on our 5 policies, the behavior tree will move to the next child node. Basically, it will check if there's any violations on all of our 5 policies. If the request will only be accepted if all 5 policies are satisfied and there will be no violation on these policies. And even if there's only 1 violation on one of the policies, the request will be declined. Here are benefits of using behavior traits: that the behavior trait is efficient and explainable. Also, the behavior traits very easy to modify. For example, for our context policy and the personal policy, it may not always be the case. So sometimes we may not be checking on those 2 policies. And for behavior traits, it's very easy to modify and just remove those 2 policies in some cases. So now I'll be talking about the strengths and the limitations of our implementations. So for strengths, we have emotions as heuristics, and we have semantic markers of negative objects, and we also did some explore on the context. Other than that, so although we have addressed the policies of safety, privacy, legality, and emotions, one particularly difficult problem to solve is making moral decisions. These decisions may not necessarily be dangerous or illegal, but do have negative moral implications. So we hope that both emotional and the context policies can begin to allow robots to make these type of decisions. However, more research needs to be done specifically to improve this area of ethical robotics decision makings. Also, there's a huge room for improvement to get accurate emotion and context information. So I believe this will be the end of our presentation. We thank you for your time, and thanks for watching our presentation.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, so the reason for sharing this video is these videos are because the proposals are amazing, and if you know about it, it's better to participate in the discussions and understanding about the hackathon solutions. So yes, I'm seeing some members who actually provided this amazing proposal. Would you like to highlight your solution? Like, what were some of the challenges? Or this was amazing and long, but what's the essence of your team's proposal? Would you like to add? Yeah.
Would you like to come to the mic?
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I wasn't prepared for this.
That's okay.
Yeah, but I think as mentioned in the presentation, so the key, I think there's like two key novelties. First is we include the emotions and context information, which is really important. However, it's also very challenging to implement it in real life. The other one is we adopt the behavior trees for the implementation, which I think is a practical way for real life implementation because people have been using it in various applications, even in robotics, although it is underrepresented. And the behavior tree compared to other methods is explainable and it's also based on human design, which is safe and easy to modify. And in the long term, we believe like these methods could be the base steps for designing a learning-based methods in the future, because all the data, like all the data from the behavior tree designs could be used for learning-based methods. I think that's some thoughts that's not in the presentation, but it would be interesting to share.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. And I will also want to add that you may sit down. Thank you. The team proposal from team 2, they were actually the winner from the last year's robotics hackathon. So it's good to see them again. And shall we move on to the other proposals? Sure. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to talk about Ethics Challenge organized by ICRA 2022. My team includes Sachin Pulil, Zishan Islam, Shiksha Sabharwal, and Aditya Chebi. Next, please. All right. The problem statement for our ethics challenge is to propose an ethical policy framework for a social robot with an indoor environment that fetches objects from position A to position B based on human commands. So that is the main theme of our ethics challenge. And we are focusing on various parameters, including issues, principles. We talk about our approach, our assumptions, the scope of the problem, the basic principles, the operator class, the policy, and at the end, we also define the algorithm, as well as strengths and weaknesses. All right. So the design of our policy is based on values. So there are total 5 values that we take into account, which define our entire project. So the values are autonomy, safety, privacy, transparency, and inclusivity. In autonomy, we focus on the user. The user should always be in control of the robot's decisions. So the user should be having the command, the control to lead the robot's decisions. For safety, we have robot will always operate prioritizing the safety of humans. The robot at all times should take care of the safety of humans and shall not harm humans in any way. For privacy, we have data is collected only through informed consent. So we make sure to include the privacy factor in our policy in order to not collect data without any consent, and only after asking for permission from the user or the owner of the robot. For transparency, we talk about the ethics policy, and the decisions made from it will always be made accessible to the user. So the data, and the policy and the decisions should always be accessible to the user or the owner of the robot, and there shall be no hidden secrets or anything like that. For inclusivity, we have policy may be adapted to each country or religion or region. So basically in inclusivity, we mean that our policy is inclusive or flexible with any countries, values, and policies. So that's about it. Now over to you, Sachin. Thank you.
So when we were thinking about the robot fetching items around the house, we thought, okay, first of all, who's going to be using the robot? It's not always the owner. You know, it might be the owner's kids. It might be a person who's maybe disabled, that might need a little bit more help. It might be a neighbor. It might even be like a first responder. So we thought all these different people should not have access to the same items, right? The same way like an underage child should not be able to ask for alcohol or maybe financial documents like credit cards and all that. So what we decided is, depending on the person who's using the robot as well as the item that's being fetched, we'd have specific rules. Now these rules, most of it would be set by the company. For example, there are some things that are just infeasible for the robot to fetch, like the robot cannot go fetch a table, right? And similarly, there will be some things that are easy for the robot to fetch, like for example, credit cards, but then we want to limit their usage, right? So in these cases, we make these rules customizable to the user to a certain extent so that the user has autonomy of the robot's decision-making process. Now, for our decision-making algorithm, we follow 3 steps. Okay, the first step is result-focused verification. So here, the robot thinks about, okay, who's making the request and what item are they requesting for, right? And depending on this, it makes a couple checks. First of all, does a person even have access to the item? Second, is a person in a proper mental condition to be able to ask for that item? And third, you know, are there any privacy settings? For example, has a person requested for data collection to be turned off? If so, then stop recording data. So these kinds of checks are performed first. Then the robot goes on to execute its task in section 2, right? And here it makes sure to keep the safety of the human and the robot itself and the environment as a priority as it executes a task, and to verify the truth of the instructions. For example, if the person goes and asks for a spoon, then the robot should not go fetch a knife, right? So it should make sure that the correct object is being fetched. And finally, after the task is executed, we have the post-processing. For example, if a fire extinguisher or any other kind of emergency item is requested, then we allow the robot to ask the human whether they need to call emergency services, right? And if the item is dangerous to the human, for example, if it's a really hot plate or if the robot is delivering a knife, then the robot makes a notification that, hey, this is a dangerous item, right? And the robot also sits and waits for 10 seconds to see if there's any feedback. For example, if it has made an incorrect ethical decision, then it can listen to the human for feedback before it stores that information or maybe communicates that information to the company so that we can make better decisions in the future. And the reason for our approach is basically we thought of a couple of questions, right? First of all, what are the most important values to the consumer? And you know, what's being currently talked about, what's currently in contention right now? For example, privacy is a big matter. Then we also talk about what are their concerns and what will the average user want the robot to do and what kind of items will they want to fetch and so on. Right. And finally, we thought about how the company can achieve a fair balance between ethical decision-making as well as product performance. One should not overtake the other.
Hello, everyone. Myself, Zishan, and I will be explaining the strengths and weaknesses of the approach that we have discussed. And thanks to Sachin and Shiksha for the prior introduction. So as you know that I'll be first discussing the strength section. So as you know that, and we have seen in our algorithm section that we don't have any learning approach or any learning module in our algorithm. Hence, very well-defined and replicable approaches are there for any particular command to be executed. So these kind of transparent and replicable methods and policies give actually a boost to the consumer confidence that what the robot is going to perform is something that is going to be safe. Now, one of the the second point is that the ethical policies that we have, the value-centric design that we have used, is having inclusivity as one of its ethical policies. Hence, in order to address that particular ethical policy, we are having flexibilities with regards to different demographics that our robot is going to serve to. And there can be differences in like values and principles to a certain extent in the different demographics. Hence, in order to address that, a certain amount of flexibility will be given to the customers to customize what can be banned and what cannot be banned in certain different areas. So coming to the weakness section, and this is like the weaknesses that we have observed are mostly very fundamental ethical questions that have plagued humanity since ever. So for example, choice and safety are freedom of choice and safety are two fundamental values that are always against each other. They are like kind of trade-offs. So giving more of one will reduce the other. So it is like a zero-sum game. So we have to decide what amount of freedom should be given to the user in order to guarantee its safety. There are certain gray areas in ethical concerns where harm has to be quantified. I mean, the situation is something like it has to do a greater harm or a lesser harm. Our robot has to be taught how it can measure or quantify varying degrees of harm and perform in the most optimized way in those situations. And these particular policies have not been designed with all the stakeholders in the room at the same time. So that is it. Next. So that is it from our side, guys. Thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you.
Hello.
All right, thank you. We actually, so that was team 4, and we actually have 2 more videos, but due to the interest of time and the schedule, we'll be playing it during the break. But I see that Sachin from team 4 is in the Zoom, is that correct? Can you shout out?
Yeah,
Yes?
that's right.
Oh, hi, okay, so would you like to, I don't know, share the essence or the highlight of your team's amazing submission or the proposal?
Sure. Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, but maybe a little,
Perfect.
up, please, a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Much better, thank you.
So thank you so much for this opportunity. Regarding our policy, I believe that I think everyone's policies here have somewhat handled or somewhat addressed what items the robot should fetch and should not fetch, and whom they should fetch it for, and sort of when they should fetch. And that's, of course, something that we addressed as well. But what we wanted to focus on were other issues that were also important to the consumer, things like privacy, which is a huge debate right now. And we found research where users were more likely to use a robot if they were assured of its privacy, that their data was not being collected without their knowledge. So that's one example of a value that we prioritize. Next is transparency. Everyone is afraid of technology these days because they don't know how it works. So one strength of our policy is that you can see the table right there. You can see exactly who is allowed to fetch which item, what are the categories of items we have, and we also allow the user to control which items can be fetched. So with this transparency, we hope to improve the trust that users will have in the robot. Next up is autonomy, which is a topic that Professor Miller has discussed. And that was something that was really an inspiration for us. We wanted to make sure that the user was in control of the robot for as much as possible. Like Zishan explained in the tail end of that video, this freedom of choice also conflicts with safety. So we cannot allow the robot to fetch something that would be dangerous for either the robot itself or too dangerous for the human. And that would limit the freedom of choice for the consumer. But as much as possible, we try to give autonomy, and we do that by allowing the user to control what can and cannot be fetched. So I believe these are sort of the biggest selling points of our policy.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, we'll be playing the team 1 and team 5's video during the break. And okay, we'll take a 15-minute break, and please do come back to this room and to the chat room so we can continue the exciting part where we have the conversation as a community together. So yes, thank you.
Okay.
Today, I'm going to talk about EthioFetch, the ethical robot to fetch items around the house. Why do we need ethical constraints when talking about fetching an item from around the house? Let us assume you have a visitor in your home and they ask you for access to your credit cards. If your robot had no consideration for ethical items, it would have just handed it over. And this is a big security risk. What if somebody under the age of 18 asks for explicit content? Your robot could have possibly handed that over too. What if somebody makes a request to place a thermometer on a gas stove. That would be harmful. To ensure that none of these situations where a person's well-being is put at risk occur, our design EthioFetch was created. We have broadly defined the scope of ethical considerations into 3 different areas. The first one is location and navigation. This deals with the robot locating and navigating objects within the space of the home. The second consideration was user preference and safety. This deals with the ethical considerations to ensure that fetching an object is not harmful to the user's well-being, and it is in accordance of the user's preference of whether or not a particular person has access to a particular object. And the third consideration is the destination, which takes into consideration whether or not placing the object in the destination causes some sort of harm to the object or people in its surrounding. To better help facilitate ethical decisions, we have divided the types of objects into 4 different types. One is medical objects, which include things like bandages or medicines. The second type is monetary objects, which include objects of high monetary value like jewelry, credit cards, or money. The third type of object is fragile objects that need to be taken care of. The fourth type of object is objects that have explicit content. For each of these objects, there is an associated hazard level. The hazard level determines whether or not a particular object is hazardous to a user or not. The destination can be classified into 3 different types. The first one is unsafe. These unsafe destinations are something like gas stoves. The second destination is possibly unsafe, and this depends on the type of object that you are trying to place in that destination. And the third type of object is always safe. So let's go over how EthioFetch makes a decision. When a user asks EthioFetch to fetch something, EthioFetch adds that request to a priority queue. And then it picks the first task from the priority queue. The reason why it does this is that if EthioFetch gets multiple requests from multiple users, it first prioritizes people who have requests for medical items. It then prioritizes requests based on the user precedence set by the owner of EthioFetch. And the third preference it prioritizes based on is the time of the request. It then checks whether the first module, that is user has permission, returns a yes. If this module returns a no, EthioFetch informs the user that the task cannot be completed. If the first module returns a yes, it goes ahead and checks whether the second module returns a yes or no. And then it checks if a third module returns a yes or no. If all of these three modules return a yes, it completes the task and informs the user that the task is completed. Let us look at the first module. In the first module, it first checks if the user is below 18. If the user is below 18, the object should not be something that has explicit content or high monetary value. If it is one of these objects, then ethio_fetch returns no. Otherwise, it checks whether user has permission to access that object, and if the object, when interacted with the user, is within the permissible hazard level. If the answer is yes, it returns yes. In the second module, ethio_fetch checks whether navigation to the location is possible and whether the object is in an accessible location. If both of these conditions are satisfied, ethio_fetch returns yes, otherwise it returns no. In the third module, ethio_fetch checks whether the final destination is a user or a location. If the final destination is a location, the location has to be green to deliver the object. If the final destination is a user, the user has to accept the object. If the user does not accept the object or the location is not green, ethio_fetch returns the object to its previous location and returns no. Otherwise, it delivers the object and returns yes.
In my programming classes, we were taught things about graph theory. I was taught some of the basics of this, like what's a planar graph, what's a bipartite graph, what's a clique, et cetera, et cetera.
Who's running this one? Is it this one?
I thought, wouldn't it be neat if you did that with people? Wouldn't it be cool if like someone, I wonder if anyone's ever thought of that. Of course, I mean, at my department, nobody did social network analysis, so there was this one obscure journal in the library called Social Networks with a bunch of formulae I couldn't make sense of, and I thought, oh, well, no, maybe somebody Microsoft research, and I'm pretty sure he's still at Microsoft New York there today. Oh. So I'd kind of understood both of these. And, you know, I'm also, what do we call us, Zennials? I'm not quite a millennial, not quite a Gen X, sort of in between. I'm in this.
Yeah, got it. Where was the other one?
Today, I'm going to talk about ethio_fetch, the ethical
What's the other one?
robot to fetch items.
No, like can we go up the top of the list? More
No, we already played that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that one.
Oh, there it is.
Value?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ivan. My solution is for a value alignment problem in a deep reinforcement learning robot that's equipped with a reward function that optimizes the robot to complete fetch requests for items located in all permissible areas of a household. A value alignment problem occurs when an AI's actions towards an end goal conflict with human values. Examples of value alignment problems in this case may include a successful fetch request in which children gain access to items that might endanger them, for example, alcohol, a weapon, or prescription drugs. A successful fetch request in which visitors gain access to intimate and private material that would result in an embarrassment or safety risks for the residents of the household. Any successful fetch request made by an intruder. My solution to value alignment problems is to create and apply what I call a value framework. A value framework is a set of principles that aims to control an AI's instrumental actions for human values. The first step in building a value framework is to identify the salient human value that you want to control for. In this case, the salient human value is a desire for ensuring that a successful fetch request does not put items that might cause harm or embarrassment into the wrong hands. Once the salient human value has been identified, the next step is to extract actionable rules that will, as much as possible, safeguard the salient human value. In this case, the risk lies in putting items in the wrong hand. The primary task is sorting requesters into groups and working out the limitations to put onto each group. We can get clues on how to do this by observing how most human homes are arranged. Parents, as the principals in their homestead, have unrestricted access to all items in the household. Children domiciled in the household have a broad right to access most items in the household except dangerous items. These items are stored in acknowledged child-restricted areas. Visitors are restricted from accessing personal living spaces. They can only access items in areas that facilitate entertaining, like the kitchen, living room, and perhaps a supply closet. Intruders are denied any cooperation, and it's important that they are exposed to the homeowners once they've been detected. Our value framework will uphold these broadly held human preferences. It will identify 4 stakeholders and limit the areas in which they can send the robot to complete a fetch task. Parents will have unrestricted access to make fetch requests. Children will have broad access with limitations placed on items in certain storage spaces like gun cabinets, medicine cabinet, and the master bedroom. Visitors will have limited access. This access will be to items stored in the kitchen and in the living room area, for example. Intruders will have no access. On detection, a notification should be sent to the homeowners about the intrusion. How will I apply this solution? There are 2 problems to solve in applying this solution. The first is in ensuring that the robot can sort different fetch requests into the stakeholder groups. This is a relatively easy problem to solve. AIs are remarkably proficient at sorting tasks. They are much better at this than humans are. A robot can be designed to identify and sort parents and children in the household based on facial and/or voice recognition. A visitor could be identified and sorted by the same features accompanied by an introduction to the robot made by a resident. Any detected facial or vocal features that are not accompanied by an introduction from a resident could be identified as an intruder. Dangerous intruders could be identified by a non-introduction accompanied by telltale ambient factors, for example, the sound of a broken glass, triggered alarm, the time of intrusion, irregular lighting patterns, and usual navigation of the house. These are all capacities that could be easily realized through modern AI technology. However, one could also apply low-tech solutions like passwords or passcodes that are entered into the robot before any fetch requests. Failure to submit a passcode in this scenario would mark a person as an intruder. The second problem is more complex. How should you encode the desired behavior for each of the different stakeholders into a deep reinforcement learning agent? Reinforcement learning agents learn through a method in which a reward signal is paired to a goal. The agent is then motivated to learn actions, instrumental actions that maximize the reward signal. For a robot that fetches, the most intuitive path would be to pair a reward signal against a successful completion of a fetch task. This will teach the robot how to fetch. However, it will not teach the robot the different preferences for each stakeholder group. The traditional approach to solving problems like this has focused on making adjustments to the formalized motivation of the agent, either by adjusting the reward function, the optimization criteria, or the exploration strategy of the agent to incorporate human behavioral preferences into them. This strategy is difficult because human preferences are very complex. Some have even argued that they're too complex to be formalized. My solution is that rather than adjust the motivation of the agent, you exert control on the environment in which the agent operates. Reinforcement learning agents learn from feedback in their environment. If you control the environment, then you can control what the agent learns. I propose that the fetch robot perceives and makes decisions in an augmentable environment. The environment is augmentable in the sense that it adjusts its rewards and punishments in concert with the value framework. The augmentations will be simple changes to the permissible areas in which the robot can venture into to complete a fetch request. For example, if the robot sorts a fetch request as coming from a parent, the environment it perceives will have no impermissible areas in which it can access. If the robot identifies a request coming from a child profile, the environment will be augmented to reflect child-restricted areas as impermissible, and the robot will be punished for venturing into these child-restricted areas. If the robot identifies an intruder, all areas of the house will be augmented to return punishment signals. The only reward in the environment will be sending a notification alert to the owners. Via this approach, the stakeholder preferences alter the environment according to the value framework rather than the agent's primary motivation. The feedback from the environment should teach the fetchbot to learn the human values from the value framework. Why did I choose this solution? Under this approach, the robot is propelled by a single, easy-to-encode motivation, i.e., the completion of a fetch task within the permissible areas of its environment. However, it learns human preferences for how to complete a task for each stakeholder through feedback from the environment. This is intuitively how humans learn value preferences. For example, I do not satisfy a motivation to eat an apple by hopping over my grumpy neighbor's fence and picking the apples from his tree, because I've been conditioned to believe that it will return negative feedback from the environment in the form of a reprimand or even physical harm. However, the environment feedback rules are different if my neighbor is if the neighbor is an amiable family member. In this case, scaling the tree will not result in negative feedback. My motivation is the same, the environment is the same, but the feedback from the environment is different. This affects how I behave. A major strength of this solution is that it's easy to encode. It does not involve the complexity of trying to formalize complex human preferences into the agent. What changes is how the environment appears to the agent, depending on what category the request is sorted into. Again, this is not complex to program. It might help to think of the solution as comparable to a video game. Video games tend to center a playable agent who operates under a consistent motivation and prescribed movement. The agent is placed in different environments called game levels or stages, and propelled by the same motivation and movement must learn to navigate the environment. Deep reinforcement learning has been shown to be very effective at learning to play video games, in many cases far exceeding the capacity of human expert players. In this case, each stakeholder environment is like a different level in the video game. Each environment has slightly different rules, and the robot must learn to navigate these rules propelled by its primary motivation and by way of its prescribed movements. One weakness in this solution is in addressing how to accommodate the diversity in shapes and arrangements of the living spaces. The robot must be able to identify rooms and storage spaces in the wild. A solution to this problem is to have the labels and permissions prescribed as opposed to learned. In this scenario, once a fetchbot has been purchased, an installation technician or a detailed user guide maps and labels the residential area along with the access permission extended to the area for each stakeholder group into the robot. The solution is also effective for situations in which the owner's preferences diverge from broad preferences. For example, a parent might have a sickly child and might find it important that the child is able to access the medicine cabinet as needed. In this case, the installation mapping will omit the medicine cabinet as a restricted area for the child's profile. Another weakness is that the solution assumes that the owners are responsible and that they store items in the appropriate places. The solution might not be completely reliable in homes that don't have consistent and safe storage behavior.
Hello, everyone. We're Team R2D2 from the University of Toronto, and we are presenting the
All right, how was the break, everyone? And I'm seeing the authors from proposal 1 and 2. So Ivan and Michael, if you would like to, like one by one, like share the highlights or the sense of your proposals. Ivan or Michael, are you there in Zoom?
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Michael. Yes,
Hi.
would you like to share your team's sense and the highlights?
Essentially, we did this competition last year and we got some very helpful feedback on what policymakers would be looking for.
It's great to hear.
So instead of doing a like a category-based approach. This time we kind of focus on how to decipher like the moral gray areas. So we took inspiration from like safety engineering for like cars or any other engineering projects. And we kind of use that to quantify at least the risk associated with a decision. And so that would at least help the robot decide on a decision between like between accepting or rejecting a fetch request.
Thank you. Ivan, are you there? Okay, we can come back. So yeah, I hope everyone had a good break. So yes, now it's the exciting part. So I want to emphasize that most important goal of today is to communicate with you guys, we as a community. So please do not hesitate to step up if you have any questions or want to add any comments. And if you raise your hand, I'll pass on the mic, etc. So yes, welcome back. So before we go into the details, let's take a few moments for each of the panels to briefly introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about your background and your interest in roboethics. Can we start with Dr. Jason Miller?
Sure, I'm Jason Miller. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Engineering. I was electrical engineering and computer science, but we've just started a new school within the faculty called the School of Engineering, Design, and Teaching Innovation. My background is, and I have what's called the Canada Research Chair in the ethical engineering of robotics and artificial intelligence. So I have a background in engineering and worked as an engineer for several years before deciding to go back and study philosophy. And then I did that for a bunch of years. I started sort of focusing on ethics and technology and philosophy of technology, and eventually started getting really interested in robotics and AI, and looking at ways that we could really connect the worlds of ethics to the world and the world of engineering and computer science. So got really interested in trying to figure out ways to support engineering design and the kind of practice that engineers do day to day, getting them to bring ethical considerations into the work that they do. And so at the lab that I run, Cradle Canadian Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Ethical Design Lab, our main focus is on looking at kind of three areas of research. We look at the core ethical ideas and issues, so doing that kind of applied ethics research. We look at how that impacts and interacts with engineering design practices. And so we're doing a lot of work on developing tools that engineers and computer scientists can use to do ethical design. And I'll probably talk a lot about that today. And also looking at legal and policy issues around these types of things. We figure those three areas are really important to have in constant conversation with one another in order to get technology designed in a way that takes into account the social implications of the technology up front early on, and helps to develop coherent policies and things like that around technology so that everything kind of fits together.
Thank you. We're so excited to have you on board. And Dr. Dehart, Brendan Dehart, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So yeah, my name is Brendan Dehart. I'm the manager of the Waterloo RoboHub, which is a big space at the University of Waterloo with tons of robots, and we kind of do robot tech support and helping people install and buy robots and kind of everything related to robots and collaboration and that side of things. And recently, I also became an adjunct prof in one of the departments in electrical and computer engineering at the University of Waterloo, because I've been teaching for them for a long time, and I figured it was worth it. I've been playing with robots for a very long time, since probably before undergrad, and went through mechatronics for my undergrad and started a robotics team with a bunch of the founders of ClearPath and a few other companies. So I've had a fair amount of kind of personal and professional experience doing and working with a lot of roboticists over the years. And one of the things that I found really interesting when we did the competition last year, actually, is thinking about the kinds of pieces of, like we all are very, very focused, especially at conferences like this, on kind of what can the robots do, how do we push the robots further, what are their capabilities, all these things, but there's very little conversation about what they should actually be doing. So I kind of joined up with Professor Moon here, who was one of my undergrad colleagues, and started kind of contributing to this conversation, because it's one that definitely has to happen, and it's not one that has had it enough yet. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ajong. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Ajong. I'm an assistant professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering department at McGill University. And I direct a lab called the RAISE Lab, which has a fancy long title, Responsible Autonomous Intelligent Systems and Ethics Lab. Very, very long and nobody will remember, but it's a RAISE Lab. I come from a mechatronics engineering background, which essentially is a primer for robotics. And I got interested in roboethics in part because I was learning what robots are and how to build them, but nobody was actually teaching me what should or should not be built. And I thought that was really interesting. So I ended up taking a minor in philosophy to learn more about ethics, because I thought, okay, in order for me to be very ethical about my design choices, I should actually learn a little bit more about it. And then I got into this whole discussion about application of robots that may be ethically silent, like killer robots, sex robots, and other kind of robots. But as an engineer, I think I grew to appreciate the fact that regardless of the application, even an everyday home context, when you put an autonomous system into an environment, we always have this ethically salient situations where designers actually have a lot of power to decide what should happen. So that's where my interest lies. My students are working on the intersection of human-robot interactions. So how do we make friendly and fluent kind of interaction with robots, as well as robot ethics. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just so excited that we have the esteemed roboticists and roboticists in here and the audience over here. So Brandon, would you like to share the codes or the results from the hackathon this year?
Sure, yeah. Yep. So we can hear. All right, I'll do this so you can actually hear me. Okay, so let me share. Screen. Okay, so there's a couple of submissions that we had here that I wanted to highlight that I'm going to run, so I can actually share the new window that opens once it runs. Maybe yes, there we go. Okay, so then I want to share screen. Share. Sorry about this. It must be in another desktop. Okay, hang on. I need to put all of you on a different desktop. Okay, let's try. There we go. Okay, so this is one of our submissions that we got, and this is kind of the simulation environment, if you can call it that we kind of put together for this, trying to simulate these ethical scenarios. And how we kind of solve these things. So in this scenario that we've got here, effectively the proposals that were submitted are kind of in general in a home setting. How do you figure out when robots should actually pick up an object? Who should they bring them to? All of these things. The hackathon on Wednesday was all about, okay, take one of these proposals and then actually try to implement it in this simple simulator. So you had access to the characters, where they were, what items were where. And then effectively the participants had to kind of take that information and turn it into real code that actually picks up objects, moves it somewhere else, etc. And we felt it was really important to kind of abstract away like how to pick it up, how the robot navigates, all those things, because there's lots of people already working on kind of the robotics side of that, the hardware, the sensors, all those things. Really what we want here is kind of the decision policy, right? So when should it do these things? So this submission. Let me just double check which one this is. I believe this was from Jean-Christophe Brisson from l'École de Technologie Supérieure in Montreal, Canada, who implemented proposal 4, which was, I want to say, EthioFetch. Yes, EthioFetch, which you saw a video of a little earlier. And if I switch back in here, so we can say, okay, who do we want to actually pick up an object? Let's go with Amy, sure. Yeah, okay. The daughter wants the knife brought to, who should bring the knife to? Want to suggest something? The baby. Okay. To Ben. Maybe Ben. Okay. And then we can run it. And it will make decisions, if my mouse will work. There we go. It'll make decisions. It'll say, okay, where is Ben? You know, they're a minor, so it's dangerous, so I'm not going to do that, right? So it's kind of giving a little bit of feedback as to how that works. The challenge is then, and one of the things that we found really entertaining on Wednesday was to try to find the holes and the gaps and the, you know, the missing edge cases, right? So if anybody out there has an edge case they want to test, feel free to let us know. And Jason, do you want to suggest one?
Yeah.
So you know, as an ethicist, I got really interested in the diary all of a sudden. So it was like the daughter's diary, which is in the upper room there. So I was saying, like, look, what if the boyfriend, what if the boyfriend requests the diary?
Okay. Okay.
So it's like essentially he's, you know, a teenage kid requesting his girlfriend's diary.
Yep. That's all good according to this one.
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So again, like the policy in this case would appear to not, well, it raises a bunch of, as the ethicist, here I am, like it raises a bunch of interesting questions, right? Like what are the rules and norms around a diary, right? How do you give permission to different people? How do you build that into the robot, right? And it's complicated because then if you ask like the mom, like should the mom be able to fetch the child's diary?
Yeah.
Who gets to, so like a lot of the work that I do is like, who gets to decide about those kinds of issues? Is it the mom? Is it like just because you bought the robot and paid some money for it, do you get them to determine what this robot does in any scenario in the home? And some of the policies actually have that built into it. So I found that really interesting. What I love about the simulation environment is that it immediately raises questions and gives you the kind of visual context that you need to think through as a group. Like with all of us standing around the screen, all of a sudden we had all these questions that came up, like the ones that I just raised. So yeah, I love this.
Well, and it's interesting too, like that particular request, I find really amusing because the diary is in the room with the baby and the boyfriend and the daughter are in the other room with mom's wallet. And if you ask to bring the diary, like it's being brought to the room where the owner of the diary is. So maybe that's okay because then they're there. If it was brought somewhere else, maybe that would not be okay, right? Like how many layers down do you have to go before you kind of have your confirmation there?
Yeah. And that, I mean, those would be other ways of testing the policy for the rules around the diary. So if the daughter is in the room, can you assume that she's given permission somehow? If it's in her room, can you assume that that's just a place that it should always be? What if there are other people in the room? So yeah, just, I mean, for me, yeah, the visuals of this, like the hackathon just gave us a really interesting window into, well, what simulation does best, right? Like it allows you to see something happening and think about it differently than you would say if you were just sitting in a room reflecting on diaries and bedrooms and robots.
Yeah.
Yeah, and adding to that, I think one thing that's super interesting, or something that makes me think a little more, is these robots will be built to be interactive. So, like Jason, you were saying, if the daughter is already, the owner of the diary is in the same room where the requester is also in the room, then you can assume that this person, this owner, is consenting to this request, or at least hearing it so that she can do something about it, right? Or that if the robot happened to be in the same room when the request is being made, and then robot should be able to understand the context of the social dynamics between the two of them. Maybe they are in a fight, right? Maybe this is a big fight relating to something that she has written in the diary. Then the robot is in a contentious situation. Do we even want to take into consideration those kinds of situations? Because when it's a human fetching these items for another human, we use this context, right? But it's really really hard for us to think about it from the design context. Yeah.
Very cool. So I'm going to see if mom can give the credit card to the baby. That might be interesting. Yeah, no, okay. So because it's worth money and the receiver's too young, then it won't bring it, right? So one of the interesting things here is each of the proposals that we had come in had different values, assigned different rules. Some of them focused on the age of the people. Some of them focused very much on kind of the items and how the items are classified. The other one that I'll show you actually put together kind of like a table of kinds of users and kinds of items and which ones can go to who and when, but it was customizable, so you could edit kind of what things might go to certain people. So do we have any other ones that they want to test EthioFetch and or Jean-Christophe's implementation on?
Yes.
What do we got? Which one?
Which fetch? Which one? I love it.
What if the baby asks for the robot?
Look, can you speak up a little, please?
What if the baby asks for the robot to give a knife to anyone else in the house?
Baby knife.
Okay.
Okay.
Interesting. I know there was one that was like, you're a baby, you can't do anything.
Yeah.
But I wonder if this one is allowing. Yeah, so the response is that the object is too dangerous, so they can't ask for that object. But so that's one of the other interesting things, right? Like whoever's asking has to get tested and verified, and then where it's going has to get tested and verified. Because one of the ones we like playing with is you can drop things in a room as well, right? So like, hey, go get, I don't know why the beer is in the bathroom, but go get the beer and put it in the room with the teenagers or something, right? And it's just bringing it to a room, and if the room was empty, then that might be fine, right? And in this very simple simulation, the people aren't moving around, but potentially you then have to worry about context. Where are the people? What's going to happen with it? Is it like you're bringing it to the room to put it away? Is it a location of like put it in a medicine cabinet if it's medicine or something? Right? You have to consider a lot of those other things. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other models, scenarios that anybody wants to test on this one before I switch over to the other one?
Let's see the other one. There.
Okay, I'll switch to the other one then. All right. Okay. This one. Oh, beer to the dog.
Beer to the dog.
And start with that for the next one.
Yeah. So hopefully everybody can see this one. And it's interesting too that not only have they implemented the proposal, so this is actually, I should probably tell you who did this. So this was from Sachin Polil, who's a member of Team 5, who is online probably, from the University of Pennsylvania, implementing his own team's proposal. So Sachin, do you want to introduce your software here before we start testing it a little bit?
Or did we lose you?
Did we lose Sachin?
Looks like it, yeah.
All right. Do we have anybody from Team 5? Okay, so we're just going to start playing. Okay, so beer to the dog was the one that was requested. Let's try that. Who's actually going to ask for it, though, would be the question. Because in some of them, the dog can't ask for things. Let's just say the daughter. Let's leave it at that. Beer.
Chin's coming.
Sachin's back.
All right, so beer to buddy, and you can see there's a lot of other pieces here, and I'll talk about those in a sec, but I want to try this beer to the dog request first. Yeah, so here we go. So I'll run that again because it's a little bit fast. It says a partial user doesn't have access to dangerous items. So actually in this setup for number 5, Sachin's saying, okay. So in this setup, basically there's a set of access rules that are used, and for some reason, there we go. So basically operators have particular categories, classes, etc., and then items have particular categories, etc. And as you go through this table, they'll say, okay, well, this type of drop-off can be allowed, this one can't be allowed. But any of the ones with the star there can actually be modified by the user. So you can actually customize how the robot is acting within your own home, which allows a lot of kind of flexibility, but also enables something like the emergency officials, for example. If there's something that they legally should be allowed to do in a particular country, then you can set that and not have the user modify that, right? And you get into really kind of interesting questions about like freedoms and privacy, and like, this is a thing I bought in my own home. Why don't I have control over this? Things like that. Maybe if you want to, one of our philosophers or ethicists want to talk about that side of things.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I guess with any technology, one of the assumptions that sometimes we make is that if you buy it, it's kind of yours and you can do whatever you want with it. But we see in a lot of cases that that's not the default, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for reasons that are completely opaque to the person purchasing it. So for example, it could be that you're not allowed to modify a technology because it'll, like, and because, well, the designers don't want you to modify a technology because it'll, you know, and the way that they'll protect that is by voiding warranties and stuff like that. Sometimes they'll say it's because of safety reasons. So one of the things I used to work on was like doing research on cochlear implants, which are like these implants that some people get when they have a particular kind of hearing loss or deafness. And what we found when we were doing that research is that the only people who had access to modify anything in the cochlear implant, like, you know, you could think of it like the equalizer in your in a stereo. It was the audiologist. So like you had to go, if you have a cochlear implant, I'm not up to date, so I don't know how it works right now, but like 10 years ago, if you had a cochlear implant, you would have to make an appointment with the audiologist, go see the audiologist. The audiologist would hook up the little USB to the cochlear implant, and then like modify all the settings so that you could, you know, essentially like you're hearing, you're just doing equalization and volume settings, so that's like louder and like you get more high frequencies. Anyway, it's just an example of when we were doing that research, we asked a lot of questions like, why shouldn't the user just be able to tweak those things? I mean, this is something that you could easily provide to the user. They could just hook it up to a laptop or a computer or their phone now, because these things all have Bluetooth, and like modify the equalization settings, like, and like build their own customizable filters and stuff like that. But a lot of companies worry about like the safety implications, and the lawyers get involved. So you can imagine the same thing with robots in the home. Like, there are a lot of questions around what should be customizable, whether or not, like, you know, they want, whether or not a company is more legally averse to the idea of having law enforcement come in and ask them questions about why they program something this way or that. And you know, it's just like there's another good example about the law enforcement thing, like the iPhone, the famous San Bernardino case, where they, Apple refused to give the encryption keys to law enforcement after that shooting that happened. And you know, other companies were saying like, well, we would do that, no problem. Like we would give access to law enforcement to people's phones and things like that. But Apple took a stand. So yeah, these are the interesting ethical questions that come up with, you know, how modifiable should the technology be? What do you lock? Who do you lock out from certain features, and so on and so forth? At times it gets very complicated. It's an interesting, it's an interesting conversation to be had. And this is just like a great, simple example of those kinds of things. And by implementing a particular policy, you enable those types of modifications. And in turn, as a result of doing that, it's like that question is now a live question for that technology. Like how are you going to characterize things? Which settings are modifiable, and by whom, to whom, and how can you modify them?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, actually, so this is an interesting one, because this team is looking at the operators or the roles and its relationship to the item retrieval request. And this is reminiscent to last year's submission, where the University of Toronto team essentially looked at the problem and said, you know what, okay, who's the owner of this robot? And it was a moderator in this case, in this context as well. And there was another rule added to that, which was if a visitor is coming, And if the visitor wants to grab some water, because water is meant to be an unlimited resource, this is kind of excluded from whether somebody owns this water or not. So I find it really interesting that there is a little bit of an overlap of who is actually requesting, the role, of the personalities at play, and what that should mean to the request. Yeah.
I also find it very entertaining that they took their role as, so the way that we framed kind of the hackathon piece, and even the proposal, because this is kind of pulled directly from the proposal, is like you're a consultancy for a company that is making a robot, designing a robot, it's going to go into homes, we need a design policy, et cetera, right? So I find it very amusing that even if you're an administrator, if it's infeasible, the robot can't do it, then it's not going to pick it up. Fair, that makes sense. And if it's like a generally banned item, then only emergency officials can take it. So if it's an illegal drug, automatic, whatever it may be. But also if it's dangerous to the robot, it'll never do it. So like they're safeguarding the robot, but if it's dangerous to people, then some people can get it, right? So it's like, as long as the robot will be okay, then some people can get this object. But if it's dangerous to the robot, then no dice, right? So it's you can bury some of these kind of hidden biases in these kind of setups, and have kind of like the right to repair and all of these kind of conversations about this, right? Because then it's not even a physical thing that you can get access to, right? It's a software setting. Maybe it lives in the cloud somewhere. It's not even on your physical robot for you to kind of disconnect and open up and change things, right? So there's a lot of additional layers that have to get thought about in some of these scenarios. One thing that I really liked about this one, and I've set up here where the mom's going to ask for the fire extinguisher, they added kind of user-friendly capabilities to it as well. So if they ask for the fire extinguisher, they go get it, and then after they've dropped it off, they say, this is only used in an emergency. Do you want me to call 911? Right? Like there's kind of this additional layer of context surrounding the different items. And as you can see, like you can add new users, you can add new items, you can change the roles of different users. You can be like, my baby's now an administrator. They can do anything, whatever. Like you have a little control over that. But then the question becomes, if you change that, who's now responsible, right? Is it still the company that built this system that allows you to make that change? Is it the company maybe you're leasing the robot from someone? Right? Like my hot water tank at home, I don't own it. If there's something wrong with it, I can call someone and be like, hey, fix this, because I don't own it, you own it, right? But then I'm also at the behest of that company. If anything goes wrong, we're like, oh, we can't get someone there for 4 days. We just have no water for 4 days. I can't do anything about it because it's not my item, my object, right? And in a case like this, right, if a knife is brought to a baby because a homeowner was like, just give my whole family all the permissions. I don't want to mess around with this, right? Or maybe they say, give everybody in my family permissions, and then they have a baby, and they're like, yeah, my baby's in my family, sure. So then the baby can just do everything, right? Like there's additional layers of challenges and issues that come up as soon as you provide these kind of user selectable pieces, right? Of like responsibility and liability and all of these other things.
Yeah, this is, sorry, I'll just add to that. I mean, we're into the discussion now. So yeah, I mean, this is why, it just highlights exactly why in the work that I do in the lab with our team, we have like law students working with computer science students, working with engineering students, working with ethicists. And it really illustrates how as soon as you make a particular design decision or think about a particular design feature, in this case, like, a particular policy that you're trying to implement, you immediately think of these legal issues. It's like you can't avoid some of these legal issues when you're doing it, because when you're working in a company, it comes up, like, and this is why certain design decisions get made. So it's almost like, with these new technologies that are emerging, you have to have that conversation between, you have to understand the ethical issues. The engineers need to be kind of aware of, or somebody in the team has to be aware of those implications. But then there really is a lot of new questions coming out that link to those legal and policy related issues that need to be dealt with as well, because in many cases, the law is going to be slightly outdated. It's not going to be able to react and deal smoothly with these new kinds of technologies that come out, which is, I guess later on, we'll talk a little bit maybe about next year and the link to the robot and stuff like that. But it's like exactly pulling that stuff into this context. So,
right on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have Sachin on the call who actually wrote this code for his group. If you want to jump in and say a few words, Sachin, about your solution here, go for it.
Hi, panel. Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm really glad that you guys were able to, you know, I'm just really happy it works. To be honest, no bugs so far. Yeah, I think. Sorry, Professor Moon.
No, yay, working code.
I know, right? So regarding my implementation, it was essentially directly taken from our team's submission. I just wasn't able to do a couple of things. For example, if you check out our submission, you know that there's a cognitive test, which is taken from Professor Miller's example, where what happens if the person is not in the right mental condition to get an object. For example, if the mom is like way too drunk and she cannot get another bottle of beer, is it all right for her to order the robot to get a beer, right? So we, in our implementation, or sorry, in our policy, we propose that there be a cognitive test for the robot to verify that the person is in a mental condition to do this on their own. And that's not something that I have implemented in this code, because I had no idea. I had no way how to make that happen. So that's just one example of something that is not implemented from a proposal in here. And also another interesting difference that I noticed was that here you have, let's say, for example, V requests bring diary to someone, let's say the mom, right? And the target was also included in the code, and we had access to that. So that's not something that we thought about at all. In our policy, we directly only thought of the request. The person who makes the request is the one who is responsible for that request. So if the mom wants to bring the beer to the baby, then she can do that, right? And that was very interesting. And I didn't really know what I should have done with that. I mean, I didn't want to disallow it because I still felt it right. If the mom wants to bring the beer to her baby, hey, it's her baby, responsible parenting, but it is what it is. And yeah, that's pretty much my take on this. Let me know if you guys have anything to talk about.
Awesome, thank you. I just wanted to try before we officially move into the panel that we've kind of started anyways already. I wanted to try the boyfriend asking for the diary in this one, and I think so doesn't have access because they're not a household member, but just to test what Sachin was just saying, if Amy actually asks for the diary to be brought, I'm guessing that it will allow it because it's Amy's. Oh, okay. It is checking things. Interesting. So Amy's not allowed to get her diary. Maybe Jill can give Amy's diary to the boyfriend. Let's see. Yep. So yeah, so it's all these corner cases and edge cases that you really have to kind of put it in and play with it, and then realize, oh, there's like 3 other layers that I have to do here, right? Like it's not the kind of problem that you can. And part of the reason that we wanted to run the hackathon was like you implement what you think is going to do everything. And then we come in with edge cases that break everything. And then you have to like do another iteration and another iteration, right? It's very much like the kind of the systems design approach of you kind of build your first one, minimum viable product, and it solves 80% of the problems. And then the next version is like 85, and then maybe 88. And like those little incremental end bits are the tough parts, right? And usually those are the bits where the liability and the emergency services and laws and all of those things are going to come into play. Any other ones, or should we kind of move into our more
I'm
official?
kind of curious. Yeah, maybe one last case because for this team they've actually implemented the fire extinguisher, which was not part of what we had before originally.
Yes.
And this
the
is
water.
Yeah, and so I'm curious what'll happen if mom gives the fire extinguisher to the baby. Because now I can see how fire extinguisher anyone should be able to give it to anybody for emergency purposes. But maybe for a baby, if it were to go off, that could be a safety issue. Maybe we could give it to a dog.
Okay, let's try giving it to the baby. Let's see. Yep, all good.
No problem. Okay.
I'll say, yeah, I just want to say one thing because we focus a lot on things where, these kind of edge cases that can seem to break the technology, like make it function in a way that's really problematic. But technologies always have these kind of things built into them. There are always situations where technology can break. whether it's breaking in this kind of social mode or breaking like physically. But the flip side of this is that by doing this kind of analysis and by really thinking deeply about the design and picking those edge cases that you want to manage that you think are maybe more frequent or more problematic than the other ones. In a design, if you're thinking about the product, if you're thinking about this thing going out into the world, it's often like this is a way that you can really distinguish your product, your design from competitors, say. So it's not always just like a matter of covering your bases so that nothing bad happens to you. It's in many cases like you're not going to be open to that much liability, but it's like these are opportunities to really understand more deeply the social context that you're kind of like embedding this robot in, and how to manage that in a way that really allows the product or the robot to stand out and like behave in a way that just when people see these things happening, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me because this is how I would probably want this thing working. It's like these designers have thought through all these really interesting things that matter to me in the home. Just as an example, we see this happening more and more with smart speakers now, right? So these are like great examples of little like robots or AIs that have been in homes for quite a while now. And just like recently, you're starting to see like more voice recognition that blocks certain features. I have these things as part of my research, and I'm always asking them questions like this, like trying to break these things. Like, oh, I'll get my kids to come in, like, hey, ask Siri to read you my latest text messages from my phone, because like I still am the only one. You have single user on these Apple devices, right? So it's like, yeah, ask Alexa to do this, and like with home automation and all this other stuff, like these smart speakers are capable of doing a lot in your home, like turning on appliances, like locking doors, calling people, changing the light settings. Like you can really freak with people if you have access to an automation system and you're having like lights flip on and off and things like that. Like we've heard about, actually there have like been cases of abuse, like in abusive relationships where ex-boyfriends have control over like the ex-girlfriend's home and just like are constantly messing with like settings and doing weird things, and it's like it's a thing now. Yeah, so anyway, these are just great ways of like thinking through these kind of issues, and like these are real issues that will come up when these things are deployed.
All right, before we go into the deeper questions, like from the audience, from online and offline, do you guys have anything to add or comment or any questions? Not yet, not yet? Okay, so I have a question to the panels over here. So when I talk about this project, everyone's like, so how do you measure ethics, or how do you even measure roboethics? Assessment, evaluation. I thought it was impossible, but we try to measure it. So I want to ask all the judges / panels here. So what do you think about the ways of evaluating these teams this year and last year, and what was most important thing that you were looking for, or what were some features that were missing in our evaluation scheme this year? Or let's talk about evaluation assessment. Can we start with from
here?
Yeah,
Sure. I can comment on this. I think I mean, from an engineer's perspective, right? If you can't measure it, if you can't observe it, if you can't quantify it, it's very hard for us to design for something. And I think that's what makes the notion of ethics so hard or far removed from most engineers, because we think, how do you measure it? Because if you can't benchmark it, how do you want me to optimize for it, right? How do I do cost effective analysis? We can't do it anymore. So I think it's a necessary component for engineers to kind of try and figure out how to measure these things. Not to ignore the fact that measuring ethics of anything I'm sure there has been a lot of research since there has ever been discussion of ethics, which is thousands of years. But I think once we have a specific challenge like this, where we can somehow compute the kinds of harms or kind of thinking process behind it, even if the end result of the system is not perfect, we should be able to actually compare one solution to another. I think maybe relative measurement is something we can aspire to. Yeah, but I'll pass it along.
I feel bad for Jason having to add something to the list after the jokes are out. But I think one of the big things, especially in this domain, that we do an okay job of, but I think we could definitely do better, is looking at kind of boots on the ground implementability, I guess. Right? How easily, how effectively can you do these things? How do you measure these things? How can you trust the system that is picking up on an emotion, a cognitive level, a new guest in a home, anything like that? Right? And I think one of the other big challenges is we still don't have, and there's been tons of talks this week that have been focused on this, but we still don't really have a reliable way of picking up stuff and navigating in an arbitrary household where there's going to be Lego and cats and whatever all over the floor, right? You need to be able to apply these robots in real world scenarios, not in kind of the clean lab scenario where it can pick things up that have been knocked over, dropped, fallen, etc. Right? You don't know where it is unless you fill your house with security cameras and you're checking every object and tracking them all the time, or you put Aruka markers on everything you own, whatever it is, right? We need that kind of general understanding of where things should be or where things are kept, or like there's a conversation to be had there, both with the roboticists and with kind of the consumer side of things, to say, how do we make this standardized, right? Like everything the robot is allowed to play with is going to be on a counter or in a drawer, or are the drawer pulls in your house able to be opened by whatever the manipulator is on the robot you have, right? All of these things, all of these kind of compatibilities come into play, and the affordances of your stuff in terms of whether the robot can even do some of these tasks, right? Which is one of the reasons I think that most of the robots we see are like, a robot that cleans things up. So if stuff is in the way, it just gets rid of it, right? It cleans the pool, it cleans the floor, it cleans the window, it cleans the grill. Or they're robots that just drive around, but they're not manipulating their environment. They're just telling you about it, they're filming it, they're taking pictures, maybe they spit out dog treats, right? But they're not really affecting the world around them. And really that's where the kind of power of robotics comes in, right? That it can change the world around it, it can affect it, it can modify it, it can improve it, hopefully. Yeah. So I can add to that. When I sat down and started evaluating the proposals, the first thing I think that I noticed was that, and this became very apparent when we all sat down together and started evaluating them as a group and having a discussion after we'd done the sort of individual assessments. But what became very clear to me, and this wasn't surprising to me, is that when it comes to the technical implementation of anything, there are a standard set of approaches and tools and knowledge that you would use to do an implementation of some sort of policy, right? Like there are these decision trees, there's like the deep learning approach, there's like, there's like these different ways, like these techniques that you can use now.
Norms.
What's that?
Accepted norms.
Yeah. So the roboticists in the room were like, oh yeah, this would be difficult to implement because I see how this works, it improves transparency, it does this kind of thing. We don't have really those things yet for ethics, right? For designing, well, we do have them for some ethical issues. This is where I'll go with this, but we don't have them for like all the ethical issues that we want to deal with. When you look at many of the submissions, they identified a list of values that they were trying to design for, right? And included in those values are things like privacy and safety, things that we actually have quite good tools at hand for doing design work, ethical design work. So we've been doing design for safety for a long time. So like there's a whole like the FMEA, there's like, for managing risks, like the language around safety in all engineering domains is like pretty well established. There are tools, there are ways of like defining safety. Same with privacy, like we have privacy laws, there are ways of thinking about privacy, there are tools that you can use for privacy by design. But what we really need to do is like just start building out more of those standard ways of thinking about different values, transparency, fairness, like these other kinds of things, like autonomy, informed consent, so that we can get so that we can develop the kind of things that engineers need, which is tools and standardization, like for doing those types, or like at least techniques for doing those types of analysis. And it like, we're just not there yet. But the exciting thing about this is that it highlights the need for those types of tools and supports for engineering. And it provides, you know, a context in which we can start developing them and having, you know, and doing and integrating them into research, not just in an ethics context, but really start having that interdisciplinary conversation. That's so useful in doing that. So that's the main thing that I took away. And to see the integration of like the ethics research, the policies, the simulation environment, the interdisciplinarity of the teams, that really is where we need to go in order to start improving those things. And I think what we're seeing in even the submissions are like what you would consider like first design iterations on what those tools might look like in the future, right? And then we can start zeroing in on like where we need to make improvements, so that it's not mysterious. It's not kind of like this open-ended mystery, like, hey, go off and tell us what all the ethical issues are. And like we'll have like a toolkit that's available, like, oh yeah, for this type of robot, it's these types of issues. For this type of robot, it's these types of issues, right? So that like for a Da Vinci robot that's dealing with surgeries, you're going to have like a list of like norms and values that you need to think about, and a lot of those are going to come from the medical ethics community and like the medical community. And in the home, it's like a different set of considerations that you need to apply, but we'll have those things well, you know, a little bit more worked out, and there'll be a lot more research going on. So that's, yeah, that's what I found. And then of course, like that's unbiased because that's kind of what I do in my lab.
Okay, thank you. Wow. Wow, so much like important issues to think about. So I have a higher level question. So, you know, so before beginning this, I've asked everyone that's in this room whether it's easy or difficult to translate the moral values into the system. And when I asked, is it easy? No one raised their hands. So I'm wondering, based on your expertise and experience with the competition, why is it, you know, translating the ethics value into systems so difficult? What makes it so difficult? Or no, I'm gonna pass along.
Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult in part because we're not used to it. I mean, I don't think it's hard for us to think about safety and design for safety today, because and you know, some people might realize that actually safety of a system wasn't something that we used to measure. Back in the day, safety was a new thing. Do we care about safety now, right? Back in the Industrial Revolution and so forth. So in a way, because we're lacking these metrics and because we're lacking the standardization and the design norms around it, I think that's what makes the implementation of certain norms really, really difficult. In the future, hopefully, it will become much easier because the key values that we want to speak about may be much more tangible for every single one of us. And its translation to implementation may be something very straightforward. Pick up this ISO standard or IEEE standard or so forth, and it'll tell you precisely what the parameters for whatever you're designing should be. We just don't have such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big pieces is that, and the reason that we have so many excellent kind of ethicists and policymakers and designers and all of these things is that it's even hard for humans to define how a lot of these things work. And if we don't have an agreement, like with safety, it's like somebody lost a limb, bad. Somebody got cut, less bad, right? Like we have an idea, we have a scale, you know, we've been going through these things for a long time, but it's only been, and you know, like considerations of safety, like I've been saying, came into being because we had the freedom, we had the technology, we had the capability to make things safe, right? It wasn't just, you know, part of the job is maybe you're going to fall off these girders when you're building a skyscraper, right? Now it's like, okay, well, we have the ability to keep you from falling, to save you. We're going to design for that. We're going to make sure you have to do that. Like it's not an optional thing, right? But we don't have yet those frameworks, those foundations, those kind of clearly defined good and bad things, because I don't know if they even exist, and that on its own is a whole other discussion. right? Because it's based on social norms, it's based on particular societies, particular nations, particular families, households, background. Like there's so many variables in there that it's almost not something you can generalize. And really, in order to have these standards and things and to make things easier to do, you need to have the numbers, which means you need to have some kind of standard. And I don't know if we will ever get there when it comes to things like ethics and morality, because there's so many different bases, there's so many different biases and all of those kinds of things.
So I'll push back on that a little bit, because when you look at the history of engineering from a safety perspective, it was not just like a straightforward, hey, we can keep somebody from losing an arm or losing a finger. Each one of those decisions costs money for the company making the equipment. It takes time. It's going to add the requirement for expertise that you maybe don't have in-house, somebody who's, engineers who are really good at thinking about these safety issues. So although we've really internalized safety as engineers now, it wasn't always the case. This is also true for privacy, which still is not broadly internalized as a value that systems need to respect, any more than the legal requirements anyway. And it's also true if you think about sustainability and environmental concerns for technology, right? These are highly contentious issues that when they're first proposed, oftentimes companies and individuals make it say, well, that's not our concern. The fact that the environment is that our thing is doing something to the environment, that's not something that we have to deal with. We have no legal requirement to do it. It's a tough conversation. And what we're talking about here is having more of those kinds of conversations about different issues. And it's true, yeah, we haven't, to the points that have been made, it's we haven't had those conversations to the point where we have something like a standard or a standard way of discussing those things. We haven't come to agreements through those hard conversations of what we should be maximizing or minimizing, or what kind of considerations always have to be taken into account, and which ones we can, maybe not worry so much about. But I guess the positive spin is that we have those examples: safety, sustainability, privacy, where we can say, okay, well, we know that they're tough conversations. We know what those conversations are going to look like. Now we just have to have them, and we have to have that mindset that there are always going to be these new values like privacy and sustainability and safety that as engineers we're going to have to address and focus on as we realize that the technologies we're developing have impacts in those areas, or that those values are implicated in the types of technologies that we're developing. The thing that's tough to do is to sort of, well, from an ethicist perspective, I would say the thing that's tough to do is to recognize, for example, that your technology is having massive privacy implications, and just kind of wash your hands of it and say, well, it's not my problem. I mean, we are as engineers, we're in the best position to implement the changes to the design of the technology that would have a positive impact on those things. And there's no reason why we couldn't do it, but there are reasons why we'd be told we shouldn't do it, oh, this is going to cost too much. It's not a legal requirement, so we don't have to take care of that. There are a lot of reasons that you can come up with to kind of wash your hands of it. But from an ethical perspective, it's tough to walk away and say well, from my perspective anyway, that it's tough to walk away and say that you've done your job if you're failing to act on knowledge that you have about negative impacts of your technology.
Well, thank you. That was amazing, and I'm impressed that we're right on time. So thank you so much. Let us take a 10-minute break, and we'll proceed with the Q&A with everyone. And after the Q&A, the overall session. So I'll see everyone back again in 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
We have a question.
There we go.
I need to upload that because I have a right hand. Do I have to do a right hand and then?
Hi, can I grab your names, please? Both of them.
I think
Ifan,
the
hi.
font is probably just your. Just this, right?
All right, Calvin.
Verification.
Calvin.
United site.
Thank
Well, no, so that's.
Do you
here.
guys want to like come up a little
Public
closer?
pieces
I
here.
want it to be a
It won't let me
conversation
submit my
among us.
passport. And then it says upload whatever, but then it just says user icon. Okay. But it won't let me check it.
All right, so I hope we had a good break. So it's a Q&A with everyone. Why I'm saying everyone is if the panels have a question for the audience, go ahead. If the audience have questions to the proposal or hackathon developers, go ahead. And if you guys have questions to any one of us, go ahead. So it's a conversation, like online, offline, it's a conversation for everyone. But before we begin, I'm seeing a questions in our Zoom. Proceed with that.
We got sharing here. Video.
Feel free to show your cameras if you'd like, if you're online, and if you want to jump in with your question as well.
Sounds good. So I am seeing that we have a question from Sachin. How does the panel feel about weaponized robotics? Many labs has rejected the idea, stating ethical arguments, but proponents argue that it can save human lives. Ooh, we're beginning with a very tough question. Anyone from the panel?
I volunteer as
Okay.
I have been voluntold. I'll tackle this one. Yeah, so I think weaponization of robotics, for some people, it is seen as an inevitable evolution. We have technology, we want to weaponize that. Okay. Not everybody feels comfortable with this particular notion. But the portion of the question that I would like to tackle is the idea that a lot of the proponents are believing that the system can really save lives. And theoretically speaking, I think it's true. If we were to have perfect machines that can actually take into consideration the rules of engagement, the humanitarian laws and so forth, that has been in existence for decades to actually govern our warfare, If we're able to implement that into these systems, and if that was easy, I think, yes, we can make a case that these weaponized robots can be better ways to go on warfare if war is inevitable. However, I think what we're seeing today with the everyday task of just grabbing an object and delivering it to you, that has a lot of ambiguities that we as designers have to explicitly code into the system. And it's the same thing, whether it is a hard law that exists at the international level or not. So even the notion of human dignity and making sure that we take care of each other, even the enemy's dignity. How do we consider that when the machine is the one that is using this kinetic force to do harm to you? How do we reconcile that? I think that's still a human question that we need to address before we can actually talk about whether the robots themselves can be better, quote unquote, soldiers of the futuristic warfare. Yeah, I hope that satisfies your question, Sachin.
All right, thank you very much. So, okay, so we have some authors in the room and in the Zoom room as well. Any questions regarding the proposals or, okay.
So I actually have one question for the panelists. And it's referred.
Louder, please.
Yeah. So I have one question for the panel. So it is referred back to the frameworks and the standards that you guys talk about for the robotics. So I really agree, like there should be something like that. And so when I was doing this computation, so the first thing I thought was, I hope there's something like that. So that can help me to start with. So what I'm thinking is there should be some sort of formal representations or like high-level representations that could be expressed other than like natural language, like what we have right now, to describe a ethical scenario, and which can be applied to different ethical scenarios. So basically, if it's a different ethical scenarios, it could still be represented in these kind of representations, and which people can use, which can be generalized. So do you guys agree, and how do you think we can get there?
Would someone like to answer?
Yeah, I love that question because so for me, for somebody who's like not a roboticist, when I hear formal representations, my brain goes to like, what does that mean? Like, what would that look like? Because one of the challenges is really that you have ethicists, you have people who sort of focus their research on the social side of technology. And we speak in a certain way, and we use a certain style of like dialogue, and we have concepts that we throw around, like, you know, privacy or whatever. And then it takes a lot of work to do whatever it is that you're talking about. But this is exactly, I think, like one of the benefits of having these kinds of competitions is like a suggestion like this from the floor maybe makes it even you know, a potential part of the competition where we could ask like, hey, propose some, like whatever it is that you're talking, like look into one, you know, maybe we'll constrain the design. I'm thinking ahead of like up until next year maybe, but it's like maybe we constrain the design problem even a little bit more, and like part of what we can propose is that people ask for that, or like the people include those kinds of things in the proposal. So yeah, like again, like the work that we're trying to do here is a lot of translation between different domains, right? Like intellectual domains, so like engineering and ethics. So what does it mean to have a conversation between like a roboticist and an ethicist to say like, I've got this idea of a formal, like we use formal representations, here's form, and then like, how do we turn it into that? Maybe that is a very useful tool. Like, I don't know. Like, so this is a conversation maybe we could have. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there because yeah, just like you're pointing to the nature of the research that's ongoing right now. Yeah.
I think that calls back a little bit to what Ajahn was saying, right? Because really, if you have your formal representation, effectively what that's giving you is a way to measure things. And once you can measure it, then you can dump the entirety of engineering on it, statistics and all of these things, right? But figuring out not just how you're going to measure it, but actually what you're measuring and what the context is, I think is the harder part of that question almost. Because if you don't have societal norm context, you don't have, this is a house versus an office versus a hospital, is there rules, is there law, like all of the other things have to be in there. So I almost feel like the formal representation almost has to incorporate a lot of those things, which then makes it, infinitely harder to actually define something that is generalized to cover those things, right? I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm kind of also thinking about more computer science terminology of what we mean by format methods. I know there are folks within like verifiable system designs and robustness approaches who care about these kinds of topics as well. And I wonder what they would say about that question, because I'm not an expert in those. But I think it's true. If we don't have something to verify, compare against, and so forth, there's no way for us to actually move forward in any of those directions. Yeah.
I can add another question that
question from the
so here's where my mind also went. I don't know if this is accurate or not, but when I hear, so one of the things that I get as an ethicist when I walk into a room filled with engineers is like, maybe I'm there to give a talk or something, and it's like after the talk, one of the questions that I commonly get, or comments that I commonly get, was like, I thought you were going to come in here, Mr. Ethicist, and like give me the answers, and all you've done is raised the number of questions and complicated this whole mess in ways that I never even thought of before. And so I wonder, and I don't know, maybe this is just me being kind of cheeky, but I wonder if what you're asking me for is the answer in a set of formal representations that you could then just implement. I don't know if is that fair? Is that what I'm hearing? It's like, is it a little bit of that? Like, is it a little bit of like, or is it that you're asking for more guidance on how to go about getting into the ethical considerations, like what kinds of ethical considerations we should be focusing on, or maybe what values we should be focusing on? I'm not sure. Again, this is just me trying to understand the question and do that translation work, but yeah, very interesting.
It just makes me think about the design course that I teach. Like just the fundamental of engineering design process is actually starting from a need or a problem statement, right? Like, and then we turn these problem statements or needs into specifications or requirements and constraints, and then we start designing something. And I think what some of the questions may be touching on is really, we understand that there is a problem. We're not really agreed on what that problem statement really is, because it seems very broad and big. And then now we're having a hard time kind of understanding that problem statement and then turning it into requirements in a formal way, because that connection is missing, we're not able to move forward. I think that's the gist that I'm getting. Anyways.
Yeah, question leading to more questions, more things for us to solve. Okay, so I have a question for Sachin. So what is the ultimate goal of roboethics? Oh, another hard question. Is it to create a robot that makes decisions the way an ideal human does? I am curious about this as well. Would someone like to jump in?
I think I'll leave the first question to Aja, because she is at Roboethics.
Twitter handle.
On Twitter, yeah. But whether or not the goal of Roboethics is to create a robot that makes decisions the way an ideal human does, I would, as a parent, throw back and say, how are you going to make an ideal human? Because you need to, like, effectively what you're doing there is saying, we just want a robot to do what good people do, or ideal people do, or ethical people do. But then you've effectively just turned it around and said, hey, ethicists, what do ethical people do? Right? Like you just kind of like took the doc and passed it over to the next team, right? And I think, I mean, we get this a lot. Like I come from humanoid robotics for my PhD side of things, and there's inevitably the second or third question is always, but why humanoids? Why are you making a robot shaped like a person? Why does it need arms? Why does it need a face? Why, right? And a part of that is we've built our environment to like fit people in chairs and through doors and upstairs and all of these things. If you have this form factor, you can operate human stuff. But the other part of that is that for thousands of years, we've been trying to make duplicates of ourselves. And with, you know, the X Prize for avatars and Reachy and Atlas and Agility and all of these different companies, they're discovering that not only does this form factor work well for us, but potentially, and I was really interested to watch the plenary yesterday, of like, potentially our intelligence is dependent upon our embodiment. We have 2 arms with hands. We have, you know, all of these things are actually helping to create our intelligence and our ability to do these things. So if we don't, you know, maybe if you gave a dog fingers and an opposable thumb, it would get dramatically more intelligent over the next couple generations, right? We don't really know. That's a total far aside, but the ideal human question is really, you know, parents raise children, they try to raise them in a way that reflects their background, their society, their rules, their norms, generally trying to make it the world a little bit better for their kids than it was for them. You know, all of these things are we're all incrementally improving lives, hopefully. What like stopping point do you then put the robot at, right? Like, how do you decide, okay, this is good enough, this is the functional, right? Like the robot has to be as good as a toddler or, you know, the average 16-year-old, whatever it is, right? Like, how do you pick that line is kind of the question, right? Oh,
sure. Talk to me about the ethics of trying to imitate the ethics of human beings using roboethics. Is it correct for me to assume that roboethics implies imitating human ethics? And if that is true, is it actually ethical to do that?
That's a great and related question. And Brandon wants to jump in again.
No, you can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and like you're never going to get a satisfactory answer from me, I promise you that. So it's a good question because it just like it kind of begs that question that was there in the first place. Like, is there a right way to do this or that or the other thing, right? And what we find in ethics is that there are, you know, even after thousands of years of having these debates, I mean, and literally for thousands of years, this has been going on in philosophy. It hasn't changed that much. Like, there's still these core questions that we ask and that we have no clear answer on. You know, we understand why we come to different positions, but one of the things you get in ethics are like what you would call legitimate disagreements, or like call them expert disagreements. This is where you have 2 positions on a question, like what's the right thing to do. And the way that in ethics, the way that we offer up an answer is in the form of an argument, right? So you make an argument that's meant to be compelling and like a good argument, and it's considered counterexamples, and it's like that's how we do things in philosophy. But even after doing that, you can still reach these points where you've got a legitimate disagreement, which means that you've made a couple of really good arguments, but you're just on 2 different sides of the debate. And there's no real way of resolving that when it comes down to it, except by fiat. Like, you just kind of say, well, we're choosing this one and we're all going to agree. So it comes down to a kind of a process, the process that you use when you're talking about you know, deciding at a public policy level, which is kind of what you're doing in many cases when you're designing technology. You're trying to design for like a range of situations. So you're essentially creating a policy. So the process that you use, the kind of process that we use in democratic deliberations and in like group decision making, is the most important thing. It's how do you come up with a fair process, or like a process that confers a legitimacy on the decision that you make. And so we were asked to consider like what would be an ethical robot, right? Like it was the first question that you put in the thing. And I thought a lot about that. And I was like, I think I have a kind of a rough answer that gets to this, which is really as good as I think it's going to get, because it focuses on this fact that you can't always, there's no right or wrong answer in many cases. They're just different positions that seem equally good. Is that like an ethical robot is one that, this is what I've written down, is what this, take this as a like first pass at a definition. It's one that has been designed explicitly taking into account ethical considerations, so things like the values that we've been talking about. But using the latest ethical design tools, knowledge, and techniques from the people who do the work of like thinking about this and having the conversations. So this is how we do things in other domains like medicine or politics or whatever. Like that's how we go about resolving these. Well, it's about how we go about finding a path forward when you have to act, but you recognize that there are legitimate disagreements that you have to that you've come up against. And then you always, you know, the idea here is that there's always the option of you have to keep open the idea that things are going to change, and you've got to just like be ready to adapt to those changes. Which is why I think it's important to think about these issues in design, because then you can make the design flexible to change in ways that you might not otherwise. Like you might get locked in if you go down a path for 5-10 years in designing technology, and you never thought that this was an issue. Like some design decision you'd have to change, and it can be very hard to go back and reverse that, and you know, touching all these different, like you know, like the year 2000 problem. Like you've never thought, I never thought this technology was going to be around that long, that we need 4 digits for a date or something like that, right? So you like try to save some space. Anyway, well, I don't know if that helps, but it's the best answer I can give, I think. Yeah.
It gave me things to think about.
Welcome to ethics. Welcome to, I asked a question, and the answer gave me 4 more questions. I think one of the big things too, and I think we talked about this maybe yesterday, was like, I almost feel like, and I will give Roboethics the chance to say what Roboethics is, but I think the ultimate goal is actually to develop the tools that you're talking about. Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah. If we need to be able to understand how to make these designs, how to develop these systems, how to think about these things at the design stage. Like Roboethics really is about how to design those things. How do we develop those things? Where do we get those tools? Because otherwise we're all just kind of shooting in the dark. I mean, that's a fundamental difference between doing philosophy and doing engineering, is that doing philosophy is like you've got all the flexibility in the world to sit around and ask these questions for 2,000 years. Like nobody's demanding the answer. But when you're designing technology and you're engineering, it's like, look, I've just got to get some stuff done here. Like, so help me out. You know, don't tell me to go through like, think about safety factors in the design of any kind of technology. It's like, maybe you choose a safety factor of 3 because that's the standard practice for whatever you're doing. Like you're designing a beam for a bridge. It's like, oh, it has to be able to, you come up with whatever the max load is and then multiply it by 3. And that's the safety factor that you're building in. Coming up with that 3, somebody had a discussion, like, and when it was like at pains, whether it should be 2.5 or 3 or 3.5 or 4. 4 is going to cost us too much. 2 is not enough. Like, so from an engineering perspective, to have someone else had made that decision that it's just going to be 3, that saves you a lot of time and effort and like moral angst over like, well, how safe is safe enough, right? We need those kind of, that's the kind of thing we need, is those kind of standards and you know, discussions. Yeah.
Yeah, and apart from my Twitter handle, which is @Robotics, please follow me. I do think that the ultimate goal, I mean, I would say, I don't like to think about Roboethics as having like this one goalpost and then we reach there and then that's it. We are all ethical humans and robots. I don't think that's what we were aspiring for. Instead, I agree with what is being shared here, which is that Roboethics is actually a community of people who are interested in actually moving this ethics considerations into the robotics design forward. And it's always going to be an evolving vehicle, just like how there are safety critical systems and the designers there who are perpetually trying to make things safer and safer. We're not at 100% safety and we're done all our work. So in that sense, I do believe in Roboethics as a community effort. And I would say, personally, if in maybe 10, 20 years down the road, new robotics says building these systems treat ethics just like how we treat safety. I think that is one kind of a measure for success for roboethics as a community. Yeah.
I'm looking at the audience. I have questions for the audiences. Oh, you want?
Yeah. I have a follow-up.
Oh, yeah. All right, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead first. Nice.
So talking about rationality, you mentioned tools and standards and legitimacy of your approach. But I, as a human being, I'm not rational. I'm a very irrational being, and I think, I hope most people are also irrational in their decisions. So is it ethical to try to come up with a rational approach to ethics?
Good question.
Interesting.
They're getting us to pause and think about it while the panelists are nodding away and trying to buy time.
Yeah, Jimmy wants to jump in. Yeah, I love that question because so part of my research is I'm insisting that we need to add this non-rational part into the AI and robotics system as well. I don't know how yet, but we need room for considering it because the users who's interacting with the robot and the AI are non-rational. So I'm towards let's consider that, but how to do that, I don't know yet. But I agree with you. So how about other? Jason, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I guess again, you're gonna get this is how it works. So I'm wondering what you mean by rational, because it seems to me like yeah, if you're talking about, say, slow thinking versus fast thinking, like that kind of heuristics approach to doing problem solving versus the slow thinking, ethics exists in that slow thinking space for the most part. You'll get some disagreement with some people who are like, no, intuition, our ethical intuitions are as good as a guide as any. And what they're talking about is that fast thinking kind of approach. But certainly, I think the bulk of ethical deliberation that goes on, it's in that slow thinking. You're going to write an essay about something, right? And that's slow thinking, and that's a rational process. But unless I'm misunderstanding what you mean by rational, so yeah.
I suppose when I say rational, I'm thinking deterministic of sorts. And yeah, I guess if you're
formulaic.
Yeah, because all the solutions we saw today suggested deterministic frameworks, a decision tree of some sorts. But yeah, how do you quantify and categorize things and make decisions? Yeah, it sounds very rational. And I suppose when I say rational, I'm talking about logic.
Yeah, so I mean, a good arguments can be logical and rational. So I think what it really comes down to is going through the process of having that conversation, of deliberating on a particular design decision, and then just making. And I mean, I say this it's easy, but it's just for reasons that you choose, make that decision and then go with it. One of the things that we talk about doing, well, at least that I talk about doing in robot ethics and any kind of technology ethics is having it's important to get to the point where you have made a decision and that you can explain what that decision is. Whereas a lot of what we look at and say criticize about the way that we design technology now is that you're making a set of design decisions without understanding or thinking explicitly about the ethical dimensions. And so there's really no justification available for a particular design decision that, beyond maybe it seemed like a fun thing to do, or I didn't really think about that. The specifications didn't require me to, or something like that. So really it's just the demand here, if there's a demand, it's well, let's think about, or the challenge is let's define those things that we need to think more clearly about, and then start providing that rationale behind the kinds of decision making to assist with the kind of decision making that would come up in day-to-day problems, like doing fetch robots or something like that. Go for it.
I don't know if the question's coming. Go for it.
Okay, so this is a little bit outside the scope of design, but also kind of related. So as someone who works with robots, we're trying to make something that's socially appropriate, right? And it's acceptable to the wider population. But do you have any concerns with some of these robotic companies who are building military robots, but they're trying to promote them as socially acceptable robots? And I know that has to do with the actual marketing department, but I feel like the actual roboticists do have a say in how that's being promoted in the public sphere. What are your views on that?
So I know I can answer that about many of the companies that were here at ICRA. But the bigger a company gets, particularly an engineering company, the less power the engineers have over anything that gets to the public. So really the challenge becomes, are you only going to get ethical robots from small companies? Are you only going to get ethical robots from companies that very clearly, as part of their mission statement or their goals or their whatever, is considering things like sustainability, privacy, all of these kinds of things? Or is it like they do the minimum, like Jason was saying, right? Like they do what's legally required, but no more, right? And a lot of the times, like it's very clear and very easy to see if you look for the signs when you're at conferences like this. The folks who are kind of coming in, and most of their clients are living in spaces where we don't have a good feeling about the robots working in that space. Generally, those robots are not considering ethics right from the get-go. The challenge that we have is that robotics is a very easy field to jump into. If you have a few engineers who know how to tinker with some mechatronic systems, you can make a little wheeled robot that drives around, you can make whatever. But if you don't market properly, then your company will die. We've seen it over and over and over and over. Excellent roboticists show up, they have a great system, but it doesn't get out to market, it doesn't get market share, the company dies. Even companies supported by Apple, Disney, etc. Having enough money backing the system doesn't seem to be enough yet, at least, for those systems to get out into the real world. So either they target researchers, where selling like 10 in a year is a good year, or they have to do things that play to the lowest common denominator so they can get out everywhere, right? If you can sell it in, in our case, like Canadian Tire, Walmart, Costco, et cetera, if you can get your systems into those retail outlets, then you'll be gold. Because even if people don't need it, don't want it, and can't afford it, they're still going to buy it if it's on the shelf at Costco, right? So you get into these situations where effectively marketing is deciding what robots we see in the world. And the concerning thing is that there's a lot of company-to-company sales going on where that hook isn't there, which means the public never sees the robot until it's on the oil rig or in the war fight or whatever it is. And then the questions start coming. It's like, yeah, but we already bought 2,000 of these things. We can't, like, it's too late, right? So we want, and I think part of the goal, I find, for Roboethics is to try to like plant the seeds in the engineers' heads, in the marketers' heads, in society's heads, to realize that this is actually a set of questions and a set of kind of things that could be done that isn't being done, and kind of incorporating that by design into these systems.
Yeah, and briefly to add to that, I would say just because the military is using robots does not mean they're going to weaponize it. I think there is a difference between robots that are being used to clear landmines so that people don't step on them, so we can clear them more safely. I think there are legitimate uses of robots that way. That we shouldn't encourage each other to just say no to specific organizations and working with them just because of how the organizations are marketed. That being said, there is always the problem of dual use. Once you have a technology, you can use it in many different ways. The same thing for any kind of technology we can talk about. We can use it to harm people, benefit people, and any other use cases. So I think we need to be cautious about it, but it's also humbling for me to see how humans can be very creative. So we can retrofit the tools to whatever needs that we have. And we don't really, as engineers, have full control over that at the end of the day. So the best thing we can do, in my view, is do our very best to design systems that reflect our values as much as we can, so that even if some evil user A wants to take over the system and make it into an evil robot, it will be extremely hard to do.
Okay, thank you, panel. Oh, go ahead, Alex.
I have another question. You say that has some influence into the system design, yeah. So that basically the ethics need to be in the system, and I would basically take the counterpoint and say that has nothing to do with systems design. It is basically the culture what we see in the system. Basically, it's just in our brains. It's basically like, why is it unacceptable to use nuclear bombs? That's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Apparently it's bad, but you totally go ahead and do that. Yeah. So I think basically what happens in our brains is what we need to attack and what we need to change, yeah, in this discussion, and not so much what's in the hardware. It matters how the robot behaves, but I think that what we see in the robots matters more.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight. It just reminds me of a conversation I had in the context of lethal autonomous weapon systems. I was talking to somebody about, okay, how would we actually regulate these systems if we were to create the systems and make sure it's gonna, be on the export market for right reasons, and if one country is sanctioned, then we don't actually export to them and so forth. And I was talking to people who are really used to nuclear weapons and how that's regulated at the international level. And one of the mechanisms that we do that is, in order for you to create an atomic bomb of sorts, you need specific types of hardware and physical substances to make it work. And it's hard for people to hide the production of such a system, physically speaking. The game changer for robotics, though, is that we have the power to change the fundamental behaviors of a system just by changing the software and the behaviors around it. And it can be unpredictable from one update to the next if you're completely changing how it should be behaving from that one update to the next. So in a way, it's harder for us to think about even regulation and fixing our expectations of the behaviors or uses of these robots, in part because software plays such a critical role in these systems. Yeah, you have a counterpoint.
Yeah,
this is great.
I would say
to
that point, let's swap nuclear weapons for biotechnology, because there we are really close. It's also very much software defined and can definitely be used to produce weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's totally equivalent to robotics. So basically what you're saying is, yes, it's dual use, and it's also you can quickly change the purpose. I think that's really the change, because nuclear weapons don't have dual use. Well, maybe, so move mountains, so I could say that. It's not, once you have decided for one direction, you can't change it anymore. It's very clear what type of use. Yeah, but I would still stick to my point that basically the culture blocks us from using them in an appropriate way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for the audience. Yuan, is that Ivan, so how did your notion of roboethics change after this competition and all of our conversation today? If you would like to jump in, I would appreciate your insights.
I just want to comment on this panel. It's easily the best panel in this conference. I'm not an engineer, so I'm biased. I think this panel just made me think about how many layers we need to go into in terms of ethical concerns and how it's just such a complex issue that we think about. I'm blanking about, and what's your name? Alexander. Okay, so you talked about it's the culture that determines what we do in robotics. I don't know if I got your idea correctly, but it really just made me think about like how our scientific practices can shape more even like creative reality that it's. I'm sorry, I'm blanking.
We're putting you on the spot.
And just made me realize like how I guess for the design, like if we consider those ethical issues into it, like we take into account of all those things, but when is it enough? Like whenever we're creating this reality, we're excluding other things, and it's just difficult to grasp the degree of
more questions, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so before we move on to the award ceremony, so our panelists have been answering like what 2,000 questions. So, introducing. Okay. So, do any of you have a question for the audience here or on the Zoom? So we'll take one question from the panels to the participants.
Okay. So this is much more of a practical question because that's kind of who I am. I would love to ask anybody who participated in the proposal stage or the competition stage, if there is like one key thing or maybe two short key things that you would change about the competition. That's my question.
Oh, I'm looking at page. I'm looking at page now.
We have a few in chat as well.
Okay.
Can I comment? I didn't participate. Thank you. Yeah. For the record, I didn't participate in any of that. But I'm glad I did. So here's my question. It sounded like the competition is asking a binary question. Is this ethical or not ethical? Is that the current question you're asking? Should something be ethical, or should we say how ethical is it, or how unethical is it? Is it really a binary question that we're looking at? Is it the current question we're asking at? Is the competition addressing the core issue at hand, or was it like a simplified assumption just to get something?
I love it. You're answering a question with another question. You're getting the point of this. One thing I will say is, for me, the question for the competition was rather than is this ethical or not, it's more of an open question about how should we be designing these systems. So to me, the emphasis is more about the how, rather than whether, if that makes sense. So I don't think we can address it in a binary way, because we don't have to go into the details of this, but we know that people hold different values from place to another. To what degree we need to accommodate a certain set of values and certain localizations of things. We don't have any answers to those kind of questions, and many others that we raised today as well. So I think the question remains, for me, how should we be designing them?
I think one of the caveats anytime you're designing a competition is you have to have an easy metric, because you want to give scores, you want to have a winner, a loser, well, not really losers, you just want people to like be able to be compared to each other. And one of the reasons we chose something like a fetch task is, regardless of the conversation that the robot might have, maybe it asks and gets confirmation, whatever it is, in the end, it's either going to bring the object to a person or not, right? So it's a very kind of clear, did it do it, did it not do it? And then we can talk about the why, what it did in between, and whether it asked people questions or whatever, but in the end, right, we have a very clear, it did the action or it didn't do the action, to kind of look at as, throw 50 of the same potentially ethically vague scenarios at each of the different systems and see what the responses were, and compare them very easily, right? And I think once these systems, and we saw it with a number of the submissions, including this group submission here is as soon as you start thinking about this is in a home, there's people here, there's object, all these things, there's like 7 other layers you have to start to think about before you get to the decision of do I go there, right? Where are the people? How are they feeling? Are they in the right state? All of these other things come in. So it was kind of like a little duplicitous on our part to be like, it just picks it up or not. It's easy. Just go get the thing for the person who asked for it. And then once you dig into all of this, you see kind of the depth and the challenge that's behind it. So it's I think it works well as kind of the seed that kind of brings you into this broader world, right? But yeah, the pickup is very much definitely kind of that binary yes no piece.
Dr. Miller, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you've covered. Actually, I think you've covered it all. Yeah, these are the things that I was thinking about in response to that question. Yeah.
Okay, so that was a summary of next year's competition, I guess. So now is the exciting part. I mean, like we have 2,000 questions to answer. So we know the panels. There's an address for our homepage, so feel free to contact us after this competition. So award ceremony. So Dr. DeHart, could you please announce the winners for the competition?
Sure. Okay, so my eyes are not good enough to read.
Oh, sorry. Oops. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
You can put it forward.
Were you sharing the screen? You shared the screen, didn't you? Okay, so without further ado, the winner of the Ethics Challenge is Good Things Come in Trees. Paige, Zitan, and Emma, who are actually sitting in the front row in the room with us, which is excellent. You will be getting, so 1,300 Canadian dollars. Thankfully, I know you all are used to Canadian dollars, so that would be fine. And we actually decided that we would also give you up to $1,000 Canadian towards presenting and running a demo at We Robot at the end of the year in September. Where we have one of the chairs of the We Robot conference here. And Ajung has been voluntold to run and host and organize like a pseudo workshop related to this somehow, which we would like to invite you to take part in.
Great.
And we'll get you more details about that.
Yeah.
But just to give you an idea, if you haven't heard of it, We Robot is kind of like the premier international conference on the legal and ethical aspects of robotics and AI, but it's always had more of a robotics focus. So there you're going to find like roboticists, lawyers, ethicists, who are policymakers who are interested in all of these topics and doing interdisciplinary work. And we thought it would be a perfect opportunity to, well, we have more ideas about the competition, but to really start getting those communities like this, the community here and the community at We Robot in contact with one another, just to kind of build not like understanding of what the competition is and to pull more people into the competition. So yeah, but we'll be in touch to talk about more of the details after the fact.
At this point, I'll invite you guys to the front of the room so that we can give you guys a round of applause and the online folks can actually see who you are as well.
Yeah.
Do we want to turn or are they going to come up here?
You guys can come up by the camera.
Here.
We'll see if the camera actually works out. Congratulations, Team 3 from SFU. I don't know.
There we go. There it is. Got it.
There we are.
There we go.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was really, and to every team though, like it was so much fun reading through the submissions and seeing all the different ways that teams approach the problem solving and like doing that ethical analysis and the technical solution. So yeah.
And we actually have, I think, we have an honorable mention for the ethics challenge. So we would like to give an honorable mention to Team 2, the R2D2 Risks Ratings Database for Ethical Decision Making from the University of Toronto. It's Christina and Michael. Are they on? Oh, they're on the screen. I don't have to lean over here. So we would also like to provide up to $1,000 cash, CAD, Canadian dollars,
to presenting and doing a demo at WeRobot for the honorable mentions as well. So we can get a couple of the teams kind of in there and playing with stuff. So yes. And then as far as the hackathon goes, we decided we would give it an award for the best implementation of each of the proposals. So we have the best implementation of proposal 4 was by Jean-Christophe Sicot-Brisson from the École de Technologie Supérieure in Montreal. And I imagine it's supposed to give us extra details. That's on the slide. Okay. And then the best implementation of proposal 5 was the ethical home robot. So actually Sachin from Team 5 implemented his own code there. So both of those winners are going to get 250 Canadian dollars for the best implementations of those 2 different proposals. So we can give them a round of applause. And yeah, thank you very much. And we'll see you next year. And we hope to see all of you at WeRobot. Thank Given for being an excellent moderator and host and, you know, technology wrangler to make all of these things work. And just to give you, because we've been talking about WeRobot kind of out of the blue, it's in Seattle in September, so it's West Coast. Yeah, and, you know, if you just Google WeRobot 2022, you'll find the information about it. It's hosted at the University of Washington this year in Seattle. So.
Great, and for those of you with winning teams, you might be wondering, oh, where do I get the cash? I will forward you all the information that you will need so that you can get your winning awards. These awards have been made possible because of the generous donations or sponsorship from 2 universities. McGill Faculty of Engineering and SFU School of Computer Science has generously financially sponsored this particular event, which we're very, very grateful for. And I would also like to thank all the teams who have participated and spent the time to actually think through these problems with us and submit your proposals. I think it was really promising to see 6 different proposals submitted to us this year. Last year, there was only 1. So it was very encouraging for us to continue this forward. So thank you for making it possible. And let's continue our discussion.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
That's it, I guess, right? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
The live YouTube stream. The whole talk today was also, or might still be, getting recorded and streamed to YouTube.